It's an honor to be sitting down with you, Her Royal Highness, the Nnaabagereka of Buganda.
Thank you so much, Roxana.
Congratulations on your autobiography. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing story. I almost feel like I've known you all my life, just reading your book. And I remember thinking to myself that when public figures like yourself that are very private, naturally choose to open up about their lives and write their stories, what's the inspiration? So I'm curious to know, what's your why?
I've always thought about writing a book, although it wasn't a book to share with the nation or the world, so to speak. And I'm talking about that's the time before I even became Nnaabagereka. I'm the kind of person who always sort of journaled. I wouldn't say total journals, because sometimes I would start one, pick it up and put it in it, and put it down. But I always had, I always did writings which I kept, maybe about myself, about what I'm doing, about what's happening in my life. And in addition to that, keeping letters, actually, that people wrote to me, because in our days it was about letter writing. And so I did think that I should write a book one day and organize, just to have everything in one organized, in an organized manner. But then later on in life, when I became Nnaabagereka, all the work that I've done, I thought that I think there might be something here for me to share, like in terms of, how I got where I am, what I've done, the people I've met, the things that I've been able to do. Maybe by sharing with other people, there's something they might learn, something that might inspire them or might encourage them. So this is why I thought, let me put this in a book. Now that I'm...
And it was indeed quite inspiring. And we'll dig into the book. But I'm curious to find out which part of this book was the most difficult for you to write.
I would say the part that was most difficult to write was my childhood, because it had a number of dynamics. I grew up with my grandparents. I didn't have my parents with me. And then there's a time when they introduced my parents to me. There's a lot of sensitivity around that, which I initially felt hard to deal with, but then I did. So I would say that was the most, perhaps difficult part. Although this is, like I said, the family, I grew up with my grandparents, and lovely family, lovely people who I love a lot. This is, a very critical part of my life I spent with them and enjoyed each and every, day that I spent with them.
And we'll get into your childhood story. It's actually it's one of the parts of the book that I enjoyed the most, because I felt like it brought out a side of you that a lot of us, if not most of us, didn't know, obviously. Okay. Which part was fun to write?
The fun part to write was in my school days, I must say. School days, right from primary school in Lake Victoria through Gayaza Primary School and Wanyange Secondary School. For me, this was a lot of fun in the sense that I think I was also lucky enough that many of my friends were able to interview, to, have their stories in my book about me and about, us together. And it really took me down memory lane. I also had to pull out letters, and believe it or not, I have letters that my friends wrote to me more than 30 years ago. In one instance, a friend of mine who also has something, written in the book, who was interviewed, I came across a letter that she wrote to me 40 years ago, which I scanned, sent to her, and she almost flipped. Because, and people used to write long letters, not just a note. It was like a 3-pager. And then I went through so many other, I have a letter box, all these different letters. And so it really took me down memory lane as I was, going through this and reading the interviews that my friends and relatives gave in this case, my friends in the three schools. It's just an amazing. It just shows you how far, we have come as people. So that was for me a very interesting, very fun time, especially when it came to reading letters. And these letters, I haven't read them either. I was just opening them for the first time in so many years. But I knew I had them. They were there somewhere in a box. So it was, when I started writing my book, and especially about this part about my friends or my school days, I had to get into that box. And yes.
Thankfully, you had a lot of reference material. Sadly, I feel like a lot of us in this day and age missed out on a lot, especially not having the letters, because people had to be thoughtful. When you're dealing with technology, there's not that much thought put into what you write, But if one writes a letter and it's 4 pages long, chances are there's quite a lot that's in
And what's so amazing too was that, going through all these letters, all these, they had beautiful handwritings. They expressed themselves so well. And I'm really talking about from primary school to secondary school. And, because I think it was our main way of communicating. You would write a letter and then you wait for it, you wait for a response, in a few weeks' time. Sometimes it could even take months. But then when you get time to write, then you tell your friend or whoever you're writing to just about everything that's been happening to you, that's whatever has been happening in your surroundings if you're at school. So in that sense, the letters had to be long because there's a lot that you had to talk about. And then they would also respond with perhaps a similar letter.
And speaking about a lot to talk about, let's dig into the story, because I couldn't put this book down. 2 days tops, and I was done with it. But let's dig into the story, and let's start from the beginning. So, Dad and Mum, they meet in London, in the UK. Is that where they met?
No, they actually first saw each other in Uganda.
Oh, and then they meet as students
somehow.
Yes, somehow they meet. Their paths cross again. They meet, and then the love just grows again, and then voila, things happen, and then...
Actually, I don't know if they actually fell in love in Uganda. I don't know.
But what we do know for a fact is we have
UK,
you.
Exactly.
As evidence of something that happened.
Yeah.
And because of the situation in which your mom found herself, she was on scholarship. She could have risked her scholarship. She could have been sent back home because she was heavy with child. Or you could have ended up in foster care, which you didn't. So you were sent back home to be raised by your grandparents, your paternal grandparents, at a very, very tender age. And as I was reading the book, in my mind, I was thinking, was there a point in your life where you could have thought that perhaps your life could have turned out differently if you had been raised by your birth parents and not your grandparents, who did an amazing job, by the way? But did you ever at any point in your life feel like it could have been different for you?
Not then, at least not then when I was growing up. I didn't really lack anything, like in terms of being taken care of at home. However, in school, when you're in school and you have children who are talking about their parents, they're talking about, how they're at home with their mom and dad, and then they also go to visit their grandparents. And again, in those days, the parents were really, your grandparents are in the village, your parents are, within the town or the city. And so there were always those stories. Oh, we went to our grandparents for holidays, we did this, but then we stayed at home and did this. So for me, I was talking about my grandparents, and so sometimes I felt, maybe it would have been nice to have these two different families, two dimensions. But it wasn't anything for me to say that, oh my goodness, I wish, because all I ever wanted was just to be with them. Yes.
It's understandable.
Yeah.
It's really understandable. And speaking of wanting to be with them, you talk about the struggle to connect with your dad at some point when he comes back to Uganda, because you've been with Tata and Mama, which is what you called your grandparents, Exactly. And he returns, and then there's a struggle to reconnect, and then at some point your mom comes back because I think you reconnected with your dad before you reconnected with your mum.
Yes.
So she returns as well, and then there's that, and then she takes you to meet your grandparents on her side, whom you had never met. So you had pretty much been only exposed to your dad's side. And having been, so you reconnect with her, you connect with her family, and then you're separated again.
Yes.
For 10 years. That's a long time. And how would you say that kind of arrangement in your life shaped your appreciation and sense of community, as well as a result of your passion for Ubuntu? Because you grew up around lots of different people who I'm sure loved you to bits.
Exactly.
Was that in any way, did it have a bearing?
I think it definitely did. At my grandparents' home, it was a home where everyone was welcome. My grandfather had a big family, so there were many relatives, cousins, sisters, brothers, and the house was always full. The house was always full, and they catered not just for the children, but also for the community. So for me, growing up, I saw a lot of giving, a lot of sharing. They modeled respect, and we had to work as kids. You know, there was always house chores, so you had to know how to work. My grandfather, one thing I remember is that he was very hardworking himself. You know, I grew up at a farm. It was a farm that had hundreds of cows, but then also he was into crop farming and so on and so forth. He did a lot of things, not just for himself, but for the community. And my grandmother was equally caring, not just for her children, but also for other children who always came in. It was such a home where, you know, it was, when I look back today, because we go there, it's still there, I see it's small, and I wonder how did we all fit in the bedroom that we all slept in, you know. But I think it was one of those things where, you know, everyone is welcome. You know, you don't really just bring up your own, but you bring up everybody else who is around you, you know. So for me, that, yes, you know, growing up in such an environment also, you know, it kind of, even where I stand right now, I don't think I'm the kind of person who would like to be by myself or in the house by myself. No, I want to be surrounded by people. Of course, I do like privacy once in a while, but it's very important that I just reach out to others who may need some kind of care, some kind of, you know, if they need in any way or the other. I've never seen anyone being chased away at any point. You know, at some point you have guests who come in unannounced. We used to have many of those. They come in unannounced, they're still welcome. And they show up to eat and leave. You didn't hear anyone complaining about that then, you know.
A lot has changed.
So a lot has changed. Oh, definitely a lot has changed. But yes.
You were talking about growing up in a home that was open to so many people, and there were so many children, and there were visitors coming all the time. And that sounds like a very good environment to be in, because as a child, you learn quite a lot, right? You learn how to be around other people. You learn how to share. You learn how to be selfless. You learn how to look out for other people and stuff. So then at some point you had to get into boarding school. And this was in primary school, right? Now, as a mother who is raising a 10-year-old who joined boarding school at 9, and someone who went to boarding school at 10, I find that sometimes we struggle quite a bit as parents, because there's only so much we can give our children when they're under our roofs and in our care. We will give them the family values. We'll teach them the things that are important, but there is something that boarding school gives the children that we can't. It's basically how to live in the world when we're not there. But it's a struggle for a lot of parents. It's a struggle because there's a part of us that wants to protect our children from what we don't know. You went through boarding school. You've been running a program that is raising young girls and boys through the Nnaabagereka, Chisaka to Nnaabagereka. What would you say to a parent who's torn between these two worlds? I want to protect my child from this big bad world that I don't even know about, but I also want them to go and experience life. For example, in a boarding school, what would you say to them?
You know, parenting is one of the most difficult things, I think. It's not an easy thing at all. And I don't even know if there's that one right way of doing it. Like you said, it's a good thing that one has to look up to other people who have gone through it to see, or maybe they could learn something. But it's very difficult. And especially when you talk about parenting these days, because you're parenting with the whole world. It's not just you telling the child that the right and wrong, but then you have the whole global village that, you know, where they're learning a lot of different things that you don't have any control of. And the truth actually is that we cannot really protect them from the world because, you know, it's just like saying you protect yourself from your own house. You know, the kids have to go out there, they will have to go in the world. So I think for me, the best thing with my little experience would be to give them the right tools in terms of for them to know, you know, what to do. And this is, I think, where our own camp comes in, which we started in 2006, Chisaka to Nnaabagereka. One of the reasons actually was exactly that, you know, how do you, because parents these days don't really have time. They don't have time to spend with their children. And so the purpose of the Chisaka is really to instill the positive cultural values, as well as empowering the kids with ideas and skills that will enable them to navigate through the challenges of this world, you know, and emphasizing good cultural values because they do build character, they build strong families where people, you know, the families stay together, work together, they bring up unity within the family. And when a child is exposed to such an environment, they tend to also do the same when they go out of the home. We use the concept of Ubuntu Bulamu, and Ubuntu, this is really referring to the human values that we should all aspire to if we're to live with each other peacefully. And some of those values are, you know, they're values whether you're traditional or you're modern, it's something that's needed. So it's not outdated, although we do use the terminology Ubuntu. You are, or I am because you are, and vice versa. And some of these are, you know, integrity, transparency, a sense of shame, civility, humility. Those are things that if a child upholds those values from a young age, then you'd expect them to be able to navigate through the world much easier, to be more productive citizens when they do grow up. Another thing that we emphasize on is the skills, exposing them to different skills. There are a lot of different things that in our years we used to do, but kids are not really. They're more focused on the academics, and they're not really. So in Chisaka, we do expose them to, for example, those practical activities within sports. Also, agriculture, we want them to learn how to garden, how to rear chicken or goats, things like that. Pottery, baking, arts and crafts, artwork, fine art, and things like that. And you'll be amazed that these kids, because we actually, the children that are attending right now are from between the ages of 6 and 18, but we could have gone lower or even higher, but that's the age that we are concentrating on now. So some of them take very keen interest in these things, and when they go back home, especially, for example, those who are in S4 or S6, they tend to take these up, and then they start doing their little work, whether it's in gardening or pottery or whatever it is, and then earn some money. And there's a young boy, 9 years old, who really amazed us. When he came, his interest was to learn how to do pottery. And when he did it, when he went back home, and did some, made some pots, sold them, and that money he used it to pay school fees for other kids.
At 9?
At 9 years old,
amazing.
So he said that he felt there was a need, that these kids, their parents didn't have money to put them through school, or they are staying home, something like that. And so for me that was, and he said he actually helped 5 children. So here you are supporting one child, and the impact really is, is quite huge. But one of the other key things is the spiritual development that you need to expose the children to. When they come, they really come from different backgrounds. We do not encourage them to be in one religion or the other, but the most important thing is for them to have that the spiritual development, to give them that compass, to be able to direct them, for them to have discernment, and that kind of thing. So I think really is to equip the child with the right tools to help them, because they're going to leave you. They're not always going to be underneath your wings. You have to let them go. But when you let them go in the world, they should be able to, when they get there, they'll be able to know what's right, what's wrong. You don't have to always worry about them.
That's amazing. We used to have an inside joke with my friends. If someone did something that was off, we'd actually say, it would be nice if there was a Chizakate for older people, yeah, so that you can catch up on
and
things that you
Chizakate
miss.
could be in everybody's home. That's what I'm saying. It's not, okay, we have
But
the
you can't
camp.
give what you don't have. You honestly cannot give what you don't have. And a lot of people, I feel like some people are raising children, but they didn't get that, and which is what makes your program quite profound. But I'd like to dig into the book. So as I read the book, and this is a spoiler alert to those of you who haven't read the book yet, as I read the book, right from your birth and the mysterious dove, that just showed up, the separation from your parents, obviously, as a child, your partial education in Uganda, and then the move to the US at some point for college, and the opportunities that basically opened up for you over a span of time, and the relationships that you built over the years, which relationships are evidenced in the book by the different sides of your story that your friends share, and the people that you met. And it just felt like everything was working together for your good. I think there's a scripture that actually says that. So everything was working to bring you to a certain moment in your life, to prepare you for something that was already perhaps predestined. I don't know if that's how you felt about it. And Steve Jobs, there's one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs is that the dots always connect backwards. When you look back at your life, ma'am, was there a time that you could have seen that these dots were connected somewhere to where you're at right now? And I'd just like us to talk a little bit about this, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll get back into it. So just, was there any moment?
Yes, well, I don't know. The dots connect, like you said, but I think I knowingly, really God was taking me through this. Somehow I feel that our destiny is predetermined. And we do things we don't know as we move, but then when we look back, we say, oh, I actually went there. I went through this. I was able to do this and this and that. And how did I do it? How did I get where I am today? For me, I truly believe that God was guiding me through. Whether or not that dove that you just talked about had some kind of significance. I think it did have significance, very spiritual significance, which I'm finding out now more so than before, because even my mom told me about it in these later years, not way back, when she was being interviewed for this book. She said it. But I think, yes, God is really has been guiding me through it all, and the dots connecting, I guess. Somehow, if I had stayed in the United Kingdom and was adopted, I wouldn't have been I wouldn't have grown up with my parents. My life would have been different, of course. How different, I don't know. If I stayed in Uganda and I didn't go to the US, maybe also that would have been different. So there's always a way that God's leading us to do, and we end up where we end up because of his direction and all, especially if you do trust and believe in him.
And I suppose the dots always do connect backwards, because you can only think about it in hindsight.
Yes, you think about it in hindsight, you actually do.
We're talking about dots connecting backwards. But the part I'd like us to dig into right now is the people around you, because sometimes when we're too close to a matter, it might be difficult for us to notice what's happening. So there was a moment in chapter 2. I think you were 9 years old around that time, and you were running around, playing around. There was an event that had been organized for His Highness the King. Then he was a prince, and you were running around with a Fanta bottle in your mouth. And for a moment you stopped and you looked at him. Okay, I love stories. and you looked at him, and then you went off to play, obviously. And then there was the village drunk, BGG. I think it was called BGG, the village drunk, who had a name for you that bordered on prophetic. I found that quite interesting in reading your story. And I'm going to ask this question again. Was there a point before you became queen that the people around you might have said something about you possibly having something special upon your life?
Not that I remember. Not that I remember. And that running around you just mentioned, when we were in Entebbe, I think that was in 1972 or 73, something like that. I stopped as a kid playing around and stared and ran away. So that was, we were a number of us playing around, and I think we were just wondering why, what's the fuss? All the, the grown-ups were very much paying attention to what was going on. And so we just got up and said, okay, we're tired. And we must have been there for a very long time, waiting for him. He came, and there were all these festivities going on. And so it was just a glance of...
And you still think it was random, Your Royal Highness? Do you still think it was random?
Yeah, you see, our grandparents my father used to take us out a lot on all these things.
Because he was a chief, right?
Yeah, or mutaka. Yeah, so I think.
So you were around these circles quite a bit, even though you were not.
But during that time in 72, actually, that was when the kingdoms had been abolished, and the monarchy at that point wasn't in existence, so to speak. So this for them, for the son of Mutesa to be back, was something that, big. It was big. It was big. And I think he went to different places. But this particular place was in Entebbe, near a church. I think it is called Kakeka. I don't know if that's still the name even today, but it's called Kakeka. I think it's part of the golf field. And this is where, this, I kind of remember it. So, precisely in terms of, on what was going on and how long we waited, and, as kids we were hungry, so they gave us soda. Then we started, we left the place and started running around and stand there. And so there he was at some point. So we had to go and say, oh, this is the person they were waiting for, and took a glimpse and then ran back to the playing ground and did our thing. So that was...
Okay, so let's bring it closer to 1993. And I got goosebumps reading this part of your book. And the reason I got goosebumps is because I was there in Nnaabagereka in 1993 as a 15-year-old. So just reading about the first time, I think that was the first time, if I'm not too sure, that the king spotted you. I think that's what I remember. But you'll correct me. At the coronation.
That year, not in Nnaabagereka.
Okay.
It was after one of the...
After, okay.
Other, yeah.
So for me, I remember the days leading up to the king's coronation. There was no studying. It was the biggest event, because I was in King's College, Bordeaux. It was the biggest event. So we spent a lot of time preparing for that activity. And even though we didn't know much about the kingdom, there was such a sense of pride at being part of this grand event that was happening. So for me to imagine that somewhere at that point in time, I was there. And we had a few stories here and there of, oh, at some point the king is going to have to get a queen. And of course, as children, we're not sure how exactly does that happen. How does one find a queen in an entire kingdom? So for me, it sort of felt like we knew the king, even though we had never, really met, because we'd been in Nnaabagereka when he was whatever. And one of my favorite parts of the book was actually when he proposed, much later. And I honestly,
later.
Yes, much later.
Many years later.
I honestly didn't see that kind of proposal coming. What went through your mind at that moment? And I'm deliberate about not spoiling it for people.
Right.
On what the proposal was like, because I'd like you to tell the story.
Well, what was going on in my mind? Basically, I mean, as you may have read, it was very uneventful. This was via email. I think he was in Kampala, I was in New York. No, I was in Maryland. So, email.
Okay.
This what exactly happened. If you're ready, I'm ready.
I'm ready. That's it.
Are you ready? So I responded, I'm ready. So it was...
Did you even stop to think about it?
Not really. I mean, looking back, I don't know why I didn't think it was a joke. But then I took it, I think it's serious, yeah? So I looked at it and I was like, yeah, I'm ready too. I was 35. What was I waiting for really at that time? So I really took it as it came. I took it as it came. And it's not one of those things where you leave the email and call your friend quickly and say, guess what? No, I just took it as it came, really.
So the next thing is you say yes to this email proposal. I'm guessing that's not what you were expecting. I mean, many young people, when we're younger, we sort of have an idea of how we want it to happen, and we have all these funny things in our heads.
Yeah, but it happened differently, and I don't really think I cared a lot that it happened that way.
It didn't make a difference. Obviously it doesn't. You're here right now. So you say yes to his proposal and His Majesty's proposal and start getting set for your wedding. And obviously moving back to Uganda, that was quite a bit for you. Close to 2 decades, it was close to 2 decades in the US. And finally coming home, and not just coming home, but literally being held into the throngs of tradition and expectations. What was going on in your mind, your heart, and your spirit, having to deal with all these things?
Right. You see, prior to our marriage, I did not think hard about what it is that I was getting into. Like I said, I was 35 years old and I was just ready to get married. I did not have any formed ideas on what it is, about this gigantic role that I was about to step into. Of course, it was obvious, with marriage, you expect a family. And of course, to support my husband's enormous role, by providing services that will contribute to the development of the region and hence the country. Yeah. But here I was, a queen in a culture institution that has stood for over 800 years. Moreover, by marriage, placed close to the epics of a cultural value system within a modern world. So, but looking back, without knowing it then, it was also sort of like the beginning of the realization of my dream, a dream which I had had 18 years ago, 18 years, before then.
Which was about
which was
having an impact
about coming back home and having an impact in my country. You see, when I first left, that was in the early 80s, right after the elections of Obote II's, and the country was in havoc. There was a lot going on, very unstable in so many ways. People were being killed. I remember our neighbor was shot. a lot of things were happening in Uganda. So if you had a chance to get out, you'd get out. But for me, of course, I was lucky that prior to all that, when I was still in school, my mom, who had been in the US pretty much all her life, had already organized for me to leave Uganda after I complete my secondary school. But see, at that time when I left, I told everyone, I'm coming back in 5 years because I'm coming back home. So they said, okay, we'll see that. People who go there never come back.
They never come back.
You see, so anyway, when I got there, of course, it wasn't 5 years. It was more than 5 years. 5 years passed. And I kept on saying, another 5 years, I'll be back. But during the time that I was there, I always felt that I'm going to go back home and work to be able to help somehow. After I finish school in the US, I'm going home. And then they would ask me, but home is not such a great place. Why do you always talk about that? I said, I think, I'll by the time I'm done, I'm sure things will be much better off anyway. And I know I'll be going back. And so throughout all the school time that I was there during my university days and so on and so forth, I would work on, when I wrote during my coursework, it was all topics related to how do I help Uganda? If in the communications classes, how are we going to use communication for development in Africa, in Uganda? And so I always did things that were related to coming back home. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be with an NGO or coming home to work in the corporate world or to work as an entrepreneur. I didn't even know that much. All I knew is that at some point soon, I have to go back home. I will be going back home to work. And so in 1993, which you just mentioned, I did get a 6-month consultancy job. I wanted to try out, see how things are before I make that final decision to get back home.
And we're glad you came back home. Buganda is glad you came back home, and Uganda is glad you came back. You were sharing about how you really didn't know what to expect or what you were getting into. I'd like to pick up from there.
Yes. Also, at that time, in 1999 it was, there hadn't been a Nnaabagereka in 33 years. So I had no good sense of what the role actually meant to the Buganda. And I didn't have any preparations, no briefings or anything of the nature as you'd expect, to be given to a bride to be of a king in this case. So there wasn't any of that. But then again, the kingdoms had been abolished in 1966. And the royal household was totally destroyed. Monarchies were restored in 1993, and then our wedding happened 6 years later in 1999. So at that point, I don't think, that orienting the Nnaabagereka into her role was a priority, or that even anybody thought about it. I'm not even sure if many people really knew what it entailed, or even, if it was even necessary. And personally, I didn't really ask about it. That, are there any preparations into this role? No, it's not something that I thought about, as a matter of fact. So I really stepped in, oblivious of challenges I had. And I didn't even consider the male prejudices that might exist in a patriarchal society like ours. But looking back, unknowingly, I was being guided by the hand of God. I sometimes think that had I known what I got to understand later, or if I had approached this role from a purely logical or perspective or analytical perspective, I would have probably had a lot of difficulty. Yeah. But I was being guided by the hand of God. And just like, when you see a child learning how to walk, they cling onto their mother's body, oblivious of the dangers ahead. So I guess my innocence became my strength as I grew into this role of the Nnaabagereka.
Yeah, and I'd like to read a little bit. This is from, I think you articulated it quite well. You say, I honestly never thought about the ramifications of a budding love affair, right? And in my simple mind, I was in love with Ronnie, not the king of a great kingdom of Buganda. At 35 years old, I was ready to settle down, get married, and start a family. I think that nicely.
That says it.
that actually says
Yeah.
it all. So, in everything that was happening, yes, there were no reference points, but you stepped into this role, and yes, you were guided by God. I think for me, the big question was, how did you learn to be queen with no reference points at all? Because to the outsider, it didn't look like you were struggling at all.
Well, after 35 years, because then I got married when I was 36, after 35 years of being, living pretty much a very ordinary life, I stepped into this role and assumed the responsibilities of the people of Buganda and the high expectations that come along with it. And when you say Nnaabagereka or Queen, those are titles. And a title really describes what it is that is expected of you.
Yeah.
So I find it always very difficult when someone says, how do you feel to be a queen, or how do you learn to be a queen? I think it's just that the title really kind of describes what it is that is expected of you. Like I said, when you get married, of course you have all the responsibilities of a wife. But then I thought there was a little bit more that I can actually do. So that's when I stepped into doing other things that are supportive of the monarch, things that are supportive of Kabaka, the work that's doing, things that are in line with the kingdom program.
Okay.
One thing is that I was very much amazed at the love and passion that the people of Buganda have for the Kabaka. And from time immemorial, the people of Buganda or the Baganda have always identified with the Kabakaship as a source of core identity, as a rallying point, and as a personification for their social, political, economic, and cultural aspirations. And he's held in high regard, in high esteem, commands great respect and authority within the kingdom, but also outside of the kingdom. And what's very encouraging is that the younger generation also hold on to this conviction.
Yeah.
So by using his authority, he promotes unity, promotes peace, promotes industriousness, promotes development as a whole.
And you've done very well. You've really done very well.
But what's also, if I may add, the kingdom itself, the kingdom structure is very inclusive. We are all represented, through our clan heads. We're all represented, and therefore on that sense of belonging to the establishment. As you know, below the Kabaka, you have the chief of the royals, that is Saba Langira. You have the head of the clans, Sabataka. You have the Abataka clan heads. You have Katikido, ministers, county chiefs, and sub-county chiefs. So that top-bottom structure enables the kingdom to leverage its soft power to be able to organize, to mobilize people for development. And therefore, the kingdom really embodies, the people's aspirations. And even without political or legislative or administrative power.
And with that comes great expectations. And that comes great expectations, which, considering we're having this conversation, you've really done well with those expectations. And I think it was Shakespeare who said that heavy is the head that wears a crown. I don't remember what play it was. It must have been either one of, I don't remember. What has been the cost of the crown to you, Your Royal Highness?
Well, if you're talking about cost, you may think of in terms of freedom, that maybe you're not able to do the things that you would have done if you're not in that role. But for me, that loss is tremendously minimized when you think about the opportunities that you have available to you, the opportunities that I am able to use to be able to impact other people's lives. May lose some freedom, but then again, more like in terms of having the reach to be able to reach out, being able to influence, having a wider platform, and to do the things that I perhaps wouldn't have otherwise done. Yeah. And to me, I think in any position, wherever you're placed, you have opportunities and you have privileges, you have also responsibilities. Now, it's important that you don't let the privileges override the responsibilities, because then that's where the problem comes. The privileges will always be there if you focus on what it is that you're responsible for. Like I said, your title describes what it is that's expected of you. So sometimes when people look at royalty, they only see the privileges, and in some countries where it is so grand, like in terms of the face of it, because in Buganda it is grand in the sense that it is, in the hearts of the people. When you go out, you can see a lot of grandeur in so many other forms, and that's where you probably feel that, but they have responsibilities behind that. So for us as the people who are actually carrying this forward, we need to be more focused on what it is that we're responsible for.
And you speak about expectations, you speak about perceptions. And when we think about royalty, true to form, we think perfection incarnate. We think everything is super breezy. And the crown has great expectations, like you rightly put it, both intrinsic and extrinsic, obviously. And you do talk about some of these in your autobiography. And I guess for me the question is, Your Royal Highness, how do you get to gracefully carry the weight of this crown and still be yourself outside of the crown?
Again, I think it goes back to what I just talked about. Not being lost in what the privileges of that crown, in this case, the crown, we're talking about the title of Nnaabagereka within the crown, and focusing on what's most important. What is it that you want to do with that title? Not so much about what, the title is all about.
And speaking of the most important thing, Your Royal Highness, I'd like to quickly read something. It said, prior to my marriage, I didn't take time to think hard about what I was getting into. We've spoken about this extensively. At 36 years of age, I just wanted to get married. I therefore walked in without any informed thoughts about this gigantic role. And I honestly thought I was just coming to get married, have kids, and offer some services to my husband's enormous work, which would in turn contribute to the development of the country. So if you were to meet 36-year-old Sylvia Najinda, what would you say to her?
Well, I'll tell her to be patient, more patient, because I think at that time when I came, I somehow, maybe coming from the environment that I came in, which was a bit fast-paced, I thought things were moving so much slower. And so I tended to want to have things happen now and quickly. I was looking for results and couldn't see them in so many respects. So, but then later on I learned that, let's move accordingly. So it's important to have the patience. But most important of all, I'll say to Sylvia, 36-year-old, don't ever let God out of your side. He should be at the forefront of everything that you do. I talk about it. I grew up in a Christian family, but you see, I've always been on and off as far as faith is concerned. I was never, but it is something that it shouldn't just be on and off, but it should be always, like you say, you have to do God all the time, not just sometimes. He has to be there. If you let him, he will hold your hand, he'll guide you in so many ways. And I think that is something that I'll tell her, and I'll even tell the younger people.
And since we're getting up close and personal with you, what's the coolest thing you've done as a mom? Outside of the crown, what's the coolest thing you've done as a mom?
When in Uganda, I can't do many cool things with the kids. But kids like going out. When we do travel, that's when I am more able to do, the cool things with them, go out to the parks, although we go to parks here as well. Do things that kids like doing. We play cards here. I think that's cool. We play Monopoly and those games. I bring in those games usually to take them off so that they're not consistently on their iPads or TV. So we do other things outside of that.
It's amazing that you actually still do find the time to connect. I think one of the challenges,
but it's not all the time.
Not all the time.
I have to agree, it's not all the time.
Maybe as we wrap this up, Your Royal Highness, how has writing and publishing this amazing book, which people are going to absolutely enjoy reading, how has it changed the way you see yourself?
I don't think it has changed the way I see